Emma told herself it was the PTSD playing tricks again. The therapist at the VA had warned her about hypervigilance, about seeing threats that weren't there. But as a former Army intelligence officer who'd tracked human trafficking networks across Iraq, Emma knew the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. And the pattern in Mrs. Henderson's third-grade class didn't make sense. 24 names on the roster. 25 children in the room. One child who shouldn't exist. Welcome to Open Book Stories. Before we begin this gripping tale of hidden evil, small-town secrets, and a teacher who couldn't stop being a soldier, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these important stories alive. These stories matter. Millbrook, Pennsylvania was exactly the kind of place Emma Collins had been searching for. Population 4,800. Nestled in the Allegheny foothills where nothing much happened except high school football games and the annual Harvest Festival. It was 3 hours from Pittsburgh, far enough from the city to feel truly remote, close enough to access the VA hospital when the nightmares got bad. Emma had arrived 6 months ago with a small U-Haul truck, a teaching certificate she'd earned online, and a determination to leave her past behind. She was 32 years old, though some days she felt ancient. 7 years in Army intelligence, 3 deployments to Iraq, countless classified operations, and a specialty in tracking human trafficking networks had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. The apartment she'd rented was above the town's only bookstore, a cozy one-bedroom with exposed brick walls and a view of Main Street. It was quiet, anonymous, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear into normalcy. Substitute teaching had seemed like the ideal job. Temporary positions, no long-term commitments, working with children who reminded her that innocence still existed in the world. The Millbrook School District had been happy to hire her. They were always short on substitutes, especially for the elementary schools. Emma's first permanent assignment came in October. Mrs. Henderson, the third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, had to take emergency medical leave for surgery. They needed someone to cover her class for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. "It's a good group of kids," Principal Morrison had told Emma during the brief orientation. 24 students, well-behaved for the most part. Mrs. Henderson left detailed lesson plans, so you should be all set. Emma had accepted the assignment, relieved to have steady work for a while. Routine was good. Structure helped manage the symptoms her therapist called readjustment challenges, and what Emma privately knew was PTSD that would never fully go away. Her first morning at Millbrook Elementary started normally enough. She arrived early, reviewed Mrs. Henderson's lesson plans, arranged the classroom the way she'd been taught in her online teaching courses. The room was bright and cheerful, with alphabet letters above the whiteboard and student artwork covering the walls. At 8:15 a.m., the children began arriving. 24 names on the attendance roster. 24 backpacks hung on the coat hooks. 24 lunch boxes stacked on the shelf. But when Emma looked up from taking attendance, she counted 25 children sitting at their desks. Emma counted again, slowly, methodically, the way she'd been trained to count personnel during military operations. 25 children. Definitely 25. She looked down at the roster. 24 names, each with a photo ID attached. She matched faces to photos, checking off each student mentally. Brandon Cole, present. Sitting in the front row, Jessica Martinez, present. Second row, by the window, Dylan Thompson, present. Back corner, looking bored already. Emma went through the entire list. 24 students, all accounted for. But there was still a 25th child. A girl, sitting in the very back of the classroom, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She wore an oversized gray hoodie and jeans that were too long, the cuffs dragging on the floor. Her face was pale, almost gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. But most telling were the eyes themselves. Emma had seen those eyes before, in Iraqi villages, in safe houses during trafficking investigations. The hollow look of a child who'd seen too much, who'd learned to make herself invisible to survive. Emma's military training screamed at her that something was wrong. But her therapist's warnings echoed too. Hypervigilance, seeing patterns that aren't there, PTSD-induced paranoia. She decided to observe, gather intelligence before taking action. Basic tradecraft. "Good morning, class," Emma began, forcing her voice to sound cheerful and normal. "I'm Miss Collins, and I'll be your teacher while Mrs. Henderson recovers from her surgery." The children chorused, "Good morning, Miss Collins," with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Emma noticed that the girl in the back didn't speak, just sat there, staring at her desk. "Let's start with reading time," Emma continued, following Mrs. Henderson's lesson plan. "Everyone take out your reading books." 24 children retrieved books from their desks. The girl in the back didn't move. During reading time, Emma circulated around the classroom, checking on students' progress. When she reached the back corner, the girl's desk was empty. "No books, no pencils, no supplies. Do you need help finding your reading book?" Emma asked gently. The girl looked up at her with those haunted eyes, but didn't respond. "What's your name, sweetheart?" No answer. Just that hollow stare. Emma glanced at the nameplate on the desk, but there wasn't one. Every other desk had a student's name printed neatly on a card taped to the front. This desk was blank. "Miss Collins?" Brandon Cole raised his hand from the front row. "Are we supposed to read chapter 3 or 4? Emma reluctantly moved away from the mysterious girl, helping Brandon with his assignment. But she kept watching the back corner from the periphery of her vision, the way she'd learned to maintain surveillance without being obvious about it. The girl sat perfectly still for the entire reading period, never turned a page, never looked around, just stared at the empty desk surface. At recess, Emma tried to speak with her again, but the girl had disappeared. Emma searched the playground, the bathrooms, the library. No sign of her. But when the children returned to class after recess, the girl was back in her seat, as if she'd never left. Emma spent her lunch break in the teacher's lounge, casually asking questions about Mrs. Henderson's class. "How well do you know the third graders?" she asked Mrs. Patterson, the second-grade teacher who'd been at Millbrook Elementary for 15 years. "Pretty well," Mrs. Patterson replied, eating her sandwich. "Most of them were in my class last year. Good kids, for the most part. Any students I should watch out for? Behavioral issues? Special needs?" "Not really. Dylan Thompson can be a handful, but nothing serious. Jessica Martinez is shy. Brandon Cole is your class clown." Mrs. Patterson took a sip of her coffee. "Why? Having trouble with someone?" Emma chose her words carefully. "There's a girl who sits in the back. Dark hair, very quiet. Doesn't have any supplies at her desk." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "Dark hair? That describes half the girls. Can you be more specific?" "She wears an oversized gray hoodie. Looks undernourished, withdrawn." Mrs. Patterson thought for a moment. "That doesn't sound like any of Mrs. Henderson's students. Are you sure she's in the right classroom?" "She's been there all morning." "Well, Check with Principal Morrison. Maybe she's a new student who just enrolled and hasn't been added to your roster yet. After lunch, Emma went to the principal's office. Principal Morrison, I think there might be a student in my class who's not on the roster. Morrison looked up from his computer, surprised. Really? That's unusual. What's the student's name? That's the thing. She won't tell me her name, and there's no nameplate on her desk. Can you describe her? Emma provided the description. Morrison's frown deepened. That doesn't match any of our students. Are you certain she's actually enrolled here? She's sitting in my classroom right now. Morrison stood up. Let's go take a look. They walked to Emma's classroom together. Through the window in the door, Emma could see the children working on their math assignments. 24 children, all accounted for. The back corner desk was empty. Where's the girl you mentioned? Morrison asked. Emma stared at the empty desk. The girl had been there 5 minutes ago when Emma had left for the office. She was right there, Emma said, pointing to the empty desk. Morrison gave her a concerned look. Miss Collins, are you feeling all right? Maybe the stress of taking over a new class. I know what I saw, Emma said firmly, then immediately regretted the defensive tone. In the Army, defensiveness was a tell. It revealed more than it concealed. I'm not doubting you, Morrison said gently. But sometimes when we're adjusting to a new environment, our minds can play tricks. Why don't you take the rest of the day? Get some rest. I can have Mrs. Patterson cover your class. Emma forced herself to calm down, to think like an intelligence officer instead of reacting like someone whose credibility was being questioned. No, that won't be necessary. I'm fine. You're probably right. Just adjustment stress. But she wasn't fine, and she knew it. Because Emma had learned in Iraq that when something doesn't add up, there's always a reason. And that reason is usually something people don't want you to find. That evening, Emma sat in her apartment with her laptop, doing what she'd been trained to do: research, analysis, pattern recognition. She started with the obvious question: missing children in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The search results were surprisingly extensive. Over the past 5 years, 3 children had disappeared from Millbrook and the surrounding area. All girls, ages 7 to 10, all from low-income families. The first was Sophie Williams, who'd vanished from her backyard in 2019. The second was Maria Santos, who'd disappeared while walking home from school in 2021. The third was Lily Chen, missing since March of this year, just 7 months ago. In all 3 cases, the investigations had gone cold. No suspects, no leads, no bodies ever found. The local police had eventually classified them as runaways, despite the young ages. Emma studied the photos of the missing girls. Sophie Williams had dark hair. So did Maria Santos. Lily Chen's photo showed a girl with an oversized hoodie. Emma's hands began to shake. Not from fear, but from recognition. In Iraq, she'd investigated trafficking networks that specialized in abducting children from vulnerable families. The pattern was always the same: target isolated victims, operate in places where law enforcement was limited or corrupt, exploit communities that had learned not to ask too many questions. She pulled up information about Millbrook's police department. Small force, only 6 officers. Police Chief Richard Brennan had been in the position for 20 years. No major crimes solved, no significant arrests. Just a quiet, small-town department that seemed content to let things slide. Emma's intelligence training had taught her that trafficking networks required local cooperation. Not always active participation, but at minimum, willful ignorance. Officials who looked the other way. Communities that stayed silent. systems that failed to protect the most vulnerable. What if Millbrook wasn't the safe haven she'd thought it was? What if she'd accidentally walked into exactly the kind of situation she'd spent 7 years fighting overseas? The girl in the classroom haunted her. Those eyes, that withdrawn posture, the way she seemed to be hiding in plain sight. Emma opened another search. Human trafficking indicators in rural communities. The results confirmed what she already knew from her military service. Rural areas were particularly vulnerable because of isolation, limited resources, and tight-knit communities where outsiders were viewed with suspicion. She spent hours building a profile, the way she'd done countless times in the Army. Mapping connections, identifying potential safe houses, analyzing patterns of behavior. By midnight, Emma had a working theory. It wasn't complete, it wasn't proof, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. The girl in her classroom was real. She was being hidden in plain sight, probably moved between locations to avoid detection. And somehow, the school was involved, either actively or through willful ignorance. Emma closed her laptop and went to the closet. She reached for the box she'd kept on the top shelf, unopened since she'd arrived in Millbrook. Inside were remnants of her military life. Her Army intelligence credentials, now expired, contact information for former colleagues, and a small notebook filled with techniques for investigating trafficking networks. She'd hoped never to open this box again. But some battles, it seemed, followed you home. Over the next week, Emma conducted what the Army had called passive surveillance. She watched, documented, and analyzed without taking action that might alert potential suspects. The girl appeared in class sporadically. Sometimes she'd be there for an entire day, sitting silently in the back corner. Other times, Emma would turn around and the girl would be gone, only to reappear hours later as if she'd never left. None of the other students seemed to notice her, or rather, they noticed her absence without questioning it, the way people learn not to see things that are easier to ignore. Emma tested this theory carefully. "Class, let's count off by numbers for reading groups," she announced one morning when the girl was present. "Starting with Brandon in the front row." "1," Brandon said. "2," Jessica followed. The count continued around the room. When it reached the back corner where the girl sat, the student next to her said 24, and the exercise ended. The girl had been skipped entirely, not deliberately, but automatically, as if she occupied a blind spot in everyone's perception. Emma had seen this before. In Iraq, trafficking victims were often hidden through social conditioning. Communities trained, either consciously or unconsciously, not to see certain people. It was a form of collective denial that made investigations nearly impossible. She began documenting everything. When the girl appeared, when she disappeared, what she wore, any changes in her behavior or appearance. Emma noted that the girl's clothes were always slightly different sizes, sometimes too big, sometimes too small, suggesting she was being moved between locations and given whatever clothing was available. Emma also started mapping the school's layout, identifying exits, storage areas, and any space that could be used to hide someone. The school had a large basement, mostly used for storage, and the boiler room. The gymnasium had several small equipment closets. The library had a back room that teachers rarely accessed. One afternoon, Emma noticed something else. Principal Morrison made a call on his cell phone, unusual since he typically used the office landline. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, but immediately afterward, the girl in Emma's classroom stood up and walked toward the door. "Sweetheart, where are you going?" Emma asked gently. The girl didn't respond, just continued walking as if she hadn't heard. She left the classroom, and despite Emma's best efforts to follow discreetly, she disappeared somewhere in the school's corridors. That night, Emma sat in her car across the street from Millbrook Elementary, watching. At 11:47 p.m., a dark van pulled into the school parking lot. Two men got out. One was Principal Morrison. The other was a large man Emma didn't recognize, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. They entered through a side door, using a key. 20 minutes later, they emerged with a large equipment bag, the kind schools used for athletic supplies. But the way they carried it suggested weight and bulk that didn't match sports equipment. Emma photographed them with her phone, zooming in as much as possible. The photos were grainy but identifiable. The van drove away, heading north out of town. Emma considered following but decided against it. She didn't have backup, didn't have authority, and wasn't even certain what she was investigating yet. But she knew enough to be certain. Millbrook Elementary wasn't just a school. It was somehow connected to whatever was happening to the missing children. Emma's next move required more direct action. She needed to locate where the children were being kept. She started by analyzing the geographic pattern of the disappearances. Sophie Williams had vanished from the south side of town, Maria Santos from the east side, Lily Chen from the north. Emma pulled up property records for Millbrook and surrounding areas. She was looking for locations that met specific criteria: isolated, privately owned, large enough to hold multiple people, owned by individuals or entities connected to the town's power structure. 3 properties stood out. One was an old farmhouse 5 miles north of town, owned by a shell company registered in Delaware. The second was a converted warehouse on the edge of town, owned by Morrison Properties, almost certainly connected to Principal Morrison. The third was a large house on the outskirts of Millbrook, owned by Police Chief Brennan's brother. Emma decided to start with the warehouse. It was closest, and Morrison's involvement gave it higher priority. She drove past it several times over 2 days, noting patterns. The building appeared abandoned from the outside, but there were signs of recent activity. Tire tracks in the gravel parking lot, window coverings that seemed newer than the building's exterior, security cameras that looked professionally installed. On the third night, Emma parked half a mile away and approached on foot. She was dressed in dark clothing, carrying equipment she'd kept from her military days: night vision scope, tactical flashlight, lock picks, and a small camera for documentation. The warehouse was larger than she'd expected, probably 10,000 square feet, with loading dock doors and multiple entrances. Emma circled it carefully, staying in the shadows, assessing security. The cameras were motion-activated, but she'd dealt with similar systems in Iraq. She approached from blind angles, moving in patterns that would appear as animals or wind-blown debris to anyone monitoring the footage. A side door was secured with a commercial-grade lock. Emma picked it in 45 seconds, slower than her military training standard, but acceptable given her years away from operational work. Inside, the warehouse was divided into sections. The front area contained old office furniture and filing cabinets, probably original to the building. But the back section had been renovated recently. New drywall, modern lighting, heavy-duty locks on interior doors. Emma moved through the space methodically, photographing everything. She found evidence of recent occupation: food wrappers, blankets, children's drawings on scraps of paper. Behind a locked interior door, this one took her 2 minutes to pick, Emma found a room that made her blood run cold. 6 mattresses on the floor. Children's clothing scattered around. A single bathroom with no lock on the door. The windows were boarded up from the inside, and the only ventilation came from a single air vent. This was a holding facility, temporary housing for trafficking victims before they were moved to their final destinations. Emma documented everything with photographs, her hands shaking despite her training. She'd seen facilities like this in Iraq, but somehow finding one in rural Pennsylvania, in the town where she'd hoped to find peace, was almost more horrifying. She was about to leave when she heard voices outside. Emma froze, listening. 2 men, maybe 3, approaching the warehouse entrance. She quickly assessed her options. She was deep inside the building, with only one primary exit. The voices were coming from the direction of that exit. She moved quickly but quietly to the room she'd just photographed, hiding behind a stack of old furniture. Through a gap in the door, she could see the main warehouse area. 3 men entered. Principal Morrison was one of them. The second was Police Chief Brennan, the man who was supposed to be investigating the missing children. The third was the large man she'd seen helping Morrison load the van. "We need to move them this weekend," Morrison was saying. "Saturday night, when everyone's at the homecoming game." "All of them?" Brennan asked. "The buyer wants a package deal. 3 girls, ages 8 to 10, delivery by Monday." Emma's stomach turned. They were talking about human beings like they were merchandise. "What about the teacher?" the large man asked. "Morrison, you said she was asking questions." Emma Collins. Former military, some kind of intelligence background. She noticed the Chen girl in the classroom. "How is that possible? We've been careful." "The girl must have wandered from the holding room during the day. It's happened before, but the other teachers know not to notice." "This Collins doesn't know the rules yet," Brennan said. "We need to handle her before she becomes a problem." Emma's military training kicked in. She'd been discovered. Her operational security had been compromised. She needed to extract, regroup, and decide on next steps. But 3 children's lives were at stake. If she left now, they'd be trafficked by Saturday night, just 4 days away. She watched as the 3 men walked through the warehouse, checking the holding rooms, discussing logistics. When they moved toward the back section, Emma slipped out of her hiding place and made her way toward the exit. She was 10 feet from the door when a board creaked under her foot. "Who's there?" Morrison's voice called out. Emma didn't hesitate. She ran for the door, hit it at full speed, and burst out into the night. Behind her, she could hear the men shouting, footsteps pounding. She sprinted toward the tree line where she'd left her car. Behind her, flashlight beams swept across the parking lot. A gunshot rang out. Warning shot, not aimed at her, but close enough to make her duck instinctively. Emma reached her car, started it, and drove away with the headlights off, navigating by memory and moonlight until she was far enough away to risk turning them on. In her rearview mirror, she could see flashlights still searching the warehouse area, but she'd gotten away. Now the question was, what would they do next? Emma drove to a truck stop 20 miles outside Millbrook, parked in a well-lit area near the entrance, and tried to calm her racing heart. She'd blown her cover. Morrison and Brennan knew she was investigating them. By morning, they'd probably know she'd been inside the warehouse. Her options were limited, and all of them were bad. Option 1. Go to law enforcement. But Chief Brennan was part of the trafficking network. The county sheriff's department might be clean, but by the time she convinced them to investigate, the children would be gone. Option 2. contact her old military colleagues. But this was domestic territory, civilian jurisdiction. The army couldn't help her here without proper legal channels, and those channels would take too long. Option 3. Walk away. Leave Millbrook tonight. Let someone else fight this battle. She'd done her service, suffered her trauma, earned her right to peace. Emma sat there for a long time, thinking about the girl in the classroom, those haunted eyes, that desperate silence. She thought about the 3 missing girls, Sophie Williams, Maria Santos, Lily Chen, and the countless others who'd probably passed through that warehouse over the years. She thought about why she'd joined Army intelligence in the first place, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Emma had left the military because she'd thought the war was over. But she'd been wrong. The war against evil didn't end when you went home. It just took different forms, or different faces, hid in different places. She pulled out her phone and made a call to someone she'd hoped never to contact again. "Dawson," a voice answered after 3 rings. "It's Collins. I need a favor." Captain Jennifer Dawson had been Emma's commanding officer in Iraq. After Emma's medical discharge, Dawson had moved to a position in Army CID, Criminal Investigation Division, working domestic cases. "Collins? Jesus, it's been 3 years. Where are you?" "Pennsylvania. Small town called Millbrook. And I've stumbled into something bad." Emma explained the situation quickly, efficiently, the way she'd been trained to brief operations. Dawson listened without interrupting. "You're certain it's trafficking?" Dawson asked when Emma finished. "I've seen the holding facility. I've overheard them planning a transport. 3 children, moving Saturday night. That's 72 hours. Not much time to build a case, I know. That's why I'm calling you. I need backup, and I need it fast." Dawson was quiet for a moment. "I can't bring official resources without going through channels, and channels take time." "I know. But I can come personally, off the books, and I might know some people who can help." "How fast can you get here?" "Give me the address. I'll be there by morning." Emma texted her the location of the truck stop. Then she sat back and waited, watching the sun rise over Pennsylvania, thinking about 3 girls who were counting on someone to save them, even if they didn't know it yet. Captain Dawson arrived at 6:30 a.m. with 2 other people. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, a former ranger who now worked private security, and Sarah Chen, a civilian investigator who specialized in human trafficking cases. They met in Emma's apartment, where she'd laid out everything she'd gathered: photographs, timelines, property records, surveillance notes. "This is solid intelligence work," Dawson said, reviewing the materials. "But it's not enough for legal prosecution. We need direct evidence." "I know," Emma replied. "That's why we're going to get it Saturday night, during the transport." "Risky," Torres observed. "If we interfere with an active trafficking operation without proper authority, we could compromise any future prosecution." "If we don't interfere," Emma countered, 3 children disappear forever." Sarah Chen spoke up. She was in her 40s, with the calm competence of someone who'd done this work for years. "I have contacts at the FBI's trafficking task force. If we can document the transport in progress, video, photos, witnesses, they can move fast enough to intercept." "How fast?" Emma asked. "If I call it in Saturday night with solid evidence, they could have agents here within 2 hours." "That might be too late," Emma said. "Then we'll have to slow down the transport ourselves," Dawson decided. "Nonviolent intervention, just enough to keep the children on site until the FBI arrives." They spent the day planning. Emma knew the warehouse layout. Torres had tactical experience for securing a location. Dawson had the command authority to coordinate the operation. Sarah had the legal expertise to ensure everything they did would hold up in court. By Saturday evening, they were ready. The homecoming football game started at 7 p.m. By 9 p.m., most of Millbrook was at the stadium, cheering for the home team. Emma's team was positioned around the warehouse, each person with a specific role. Emma would document the transport with video evidence. Torres would disable the van to prevent departure. Dawson would coordinate with the FBI. Sarah would ensure the children's safety if anything went wrong. At 9:47 p.m., Morrison's van pulled into the warehouse parking lot, followed by Chief Brennan's police cruiser. Emma filmed from concealment as the men entered the warehouse. 15 minutes later, they emerged with 3 girls, ages 8 to 10, wearing oversized clothes, looking terrified. As Morrison loaded them into the van, Torres moved. He'd positioned spike strips under the van's tires, covered in gravel to avoid detection. The moment Morrison started the engine and began to drive, all 4 tires went flat simultaneously. Morrison got out, cursing, examining the damage. While he was distracted, Dawson made the call to the FBI. "This is Captain Jennifer Dawson, Army CID. I'm reporting an in-progress child trafficking operation at the following coordinates." The next 2 hours were chaotic. The FBI arrived faster than expected. They'd apparently been tracking Morrison for months, but hadn't had enough evidence to move. Emma's documentation provided exactly what they needed. Morrison, Brennan, and their associate were arrested. The warehouse was secured. Most importantly, 3 girls were recovered alive and relatively unharmed. But there was a 4th girl, the one Emma had seen in the classroom. "Where's Lily Chen?" Emma demanded when FBI agents were interviewing Morrison. Morrison, already knowing he was facing life in prison, saw no reason to hold back. "She's at the school. Hidden storage room in the basement. We kept her there during the day, moved her back and forth." Emma ran. She reached Millbrook Elementary 20 minutes later, broke a window to get in, and found the basement storage room Morrison had described. Lily Chen was there, huddled in the corner, wearing the oversized gray hoodie Emma had seen in class. When she saw Emma, she didn't speak, just stared with those haunted eyes. "It's okay," Emma said gently, the way she'd spoken to trafficking victims in Iraq. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Lily didn't respond verbally, but she let Emma help her stand. Let Emma walk her out of that basement, out of that school, into the night air where ambulances and police cars were arriving. As Emma watched the paramedics check Lily's vital signs, wrap her in a blanket, give her water, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the Army. Purpose. Epilogue. The teacher who stayed. 3 months later, Emma stood in front of Mrs. Henderson's 3rd grade class, though it was her class now. Mrs. Henderson had decided to retire early, and Emma had accepted a permanent teaching position. 24 students, all accounted for, all safe. The trafficking network had been larger than anyone expected. Morrison and Brennan were just the local operators. The investigation had spread to 3 states, resulting in dozens of arrests and the recovery of 17 children. Sophie Williams and Maria Santos had been found alive, though the road to recovery would be long. Lily Chen was living with her aunt, receiving trauma therapy, slowly learning to speak again. Emma still had nightmares, still jumped at unexpected sounds, still counted faces compulsively, making sure everyone who should be there was actually there. But she'd also found something she thought she'd lost. A mission worth fighting for. "Miss Collins?" Brandon raised his hand from the front row. "Are you okay?" "You look sad," Emma smiled. "I'm not sad, Brandon. I'm grateful." "For what?" "For all of you. For this classroom, for the chance to make sure you're all safe." The children didn't fully understand, but they didn't need to. They just knew Miss Collins cared about them, watched over them, made them feel protected. After school, Emma walked through Millbrook's main street. People waved, said hello, thanked her for what she'd done. The town was healing from the revelation that evil had been hiding in their midst. Emma had learned something important. She couldn't run from who she was. The skills that had haunted her, the hypervigilance, the pattern recognition, the inability to ignore what others chose not to see, weren't symptoms of damage. They were tools for protection. She'd been trained to fight human trafficking. That fight didn't end when she left the army. It just changed location. Emma Collins was done running from her past. Instead, she'd found a way to use it for something good. In her classroom, in her town, in her new life, she was still a soldier, just fighting a different kind of war. And some wars are worth never surrendering. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone who couldn't stop being who they were trained to be? Someone whose past skills became their present purpose? A protector who found a new mission in an unexpected place? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the quiet guardians who use their training to protect the vulnerable, who can't look away from injustice even when it costs them their peace. If this story moved you, subscribe to Open Book Stories. We publish powerful narratives every week about people who turn their trauma into purpose, their skills into protection, and their past into a better future for others. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, sometimes the most dangerous people to evil are those who've learned to recognize it, even when everyone else has been taught not to see.